In a city built on dreams, one man turned nightmares into an empire. He didn't just sell poison, he became untouchable. In the broken heart of Harlem, 1933, where hope died on cracked sidewalks and desperation hung thick in tenement hallways, Leroy Nicholas Barnes entered a world that had already given up on him. His father, a violent drunk who beat the innocence out of childhood; his mother, a shadow of silence, too afraid to intervene. Young Nicky learned early that survival wasn't about strength. It was about becoming invisible when the fists flew, and becoming someone else when opportunity knocked. He was a smart kid, teachers noticed. Bright eyes, quick mind, the kind of boy who could have made something of himself in a different world. But this wasn't a different world. This was Harlem in the Great Depression's aftermath, where black children were told to dream small and expect less, where the only men with money were the ones who took it, and the only power came from the barrel of a gun or the bag of powder. At 14, Nicky made his choice. He walked out of his father's house and never looked back. No diploma, no backup plan, no safety net, just the streets and his wits. He started small. Petty crimes, street hustles, learning the language of the underworld. But even then, he was watching, studying, planning. Because Nicky Barnes wasn't built to be a foot soldier. He was born to be a general. He just didn't know it yet. By his 20s, he'd found his product. Dope. Not just selling it, but using it. The needle became his escape, his comfort, his prison. For years, he was just another junkie shuffling through Harlem's shadows, chasing the dragon, running from himself. But even addiction couldn't kill his ambition. It just taught him something invaluable. He learned what addicts needed, what they'd pay for, what kept them coming back. He was studying his future customers from the inside out. When he finally kicked the habit in prison, it wasn't redemption. It was evolution. He'd seen the bottom, survived it, and now he understood the game better than anyone. Nicky Barnes emerged from that cell with a clarity that would reshape New York's underworld. The best product wins. Loyalty is currency, and invisibility is armor. In 1965, Nicky Barnes walked into Greenhaven State Prison, a low-level dealer facing 15 to 20 years. He walked out 6 years later as the blueprint for a new kind of crime boss. What happened in between was a masterclass in organized crime, taught by the masters themselves, his professors. Crazy Joe Gallo, a capo in the Colombo crime family with ambition bigger than his rank. Matthew Madonna, a dope dealer for the Lucchese family who understood the powder game like a chemist understands molecules. These weren't just criminals, they were architects of empire, and they saw something in Nicky that even he hadn't fully recognized. Potential. Gallo had a problem. Harlem was a goldmine for dope, but it was black territory, and white mobsters stood out like cops at a dice game. He needed someone who could move through those streets like water, someone the community would trust, or at least tolerate. Someone smart enough to build an organization, ruthless enough to protect it, and hungry enough to never stop growing it. Nicky Barnes was that someone. In those prison yards and quiet cells, Gallo taught him the mafia way. Hierarchies, insulation, legitimate fronts, strategic violence. Madonna showed him the chemistry, how to cut dope so it was profitable, but still powerful enough to hook customers for life. They taught him that organized crime wasn't about chaos. It was about structure, discipline, and the illusion of legitimacy. When Gallo got out, he kept his promise. He provided Nicky with a lawyer sharp enough to get his conviction overturned on a technicality. He fronted him $5,000 cash, a silencer-equipped Beretta, and most importantly, a half kilo of dope on consignment. It was a test and an investment. Nicky passed with honors. He didn't just sell the stuff and move on. He revolutionized the game. While other dealers cut their dope until it was barely powder, Nicky cut his carefully, precisely. His product was purer, stronger, more reliable. Addicts knew. If you wanted the best fix on the street, you bought from Nicky Barnes. Word spread like wildfire through the tenements and shooting galleries. Lines formed, money flowed, an empire began. But Nicky never forgot the lessons. He built layers between himself and the street. Lieutenants who managed distributors who supplied corner boys. He invested dirty money into clean businesses, car dealerships, apartment buildings, legitimate fronts that made him look respectable while the dope moved in the shadows. He studied the Italians' mistakes and avoided them. He studied their successes and perfected them. By the early 1970s, Nicky Barnes wasn't just a dealer. He was a businessman, a strategist, a ghost who moved millions without ever touching a bag. In 1972, Nicky Barnes called a meeting. 7 men gathered, each one a heavy hitter in Harlem's underworld. Joseph Jazz Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Ishmael Muhammad, Frank James, Guy Fisher, and at the head of the table, Nicky himself. This wasn't just a gang. This was the Council. The first major African-American organized crime syndicate built on mafia principles, but engineered for the streets of Harlem. 7 brothers, bound by an oath that sounded almost religious. Treat my brother as I treat myself. It was beautiful in its brutality. Each council member ran their own crew. Dozens of mid-level distributors who each controlled 40 or more street dealers. The math was staggering. By 1976, the council's network stretched across New York, into Pennsylvania, all the way to Canada. Tons of dope moved through their pipeline every month. The money? Over $50 million at its peak, equivalent to nearly $250 million today. Nicky didn't just run an operation. He ran a government within a government. The council settled disputes like a Supreme Court. They negotiated with the Italian families as equals, not servants, but partners. They enforced their rules with surgical violence, swift, brutal, and absolutely final. Thieves lost more than their hands. Snitches lost their lives and their families. Entire bloodlines erased for breaking the code. But beneath the structure, beneath the oaths and the brotherhood rhetoric, something darker simmered. Because Nicky Barnes understood what his council members didn't. There's no honor among thieves, just temporary alliances and inevitable betrayals. Still, for a moment, a glorious, terrifying moment, the council was untouchable. Nicky himself became a legend. He drove a yellow Volvo, a Bentley, a Maserati, a Mercedes, depending on his mood. He owned hundreds of custom-tailored suits, Italian silk, perfectly cut, each one worth more than most Harlem families made in a year. His jewelry collection alone was valued at over $7 million. He played cat and mouse with the cops, leading surveillance teams on pointless high-speed chases just to prove he could. He beat case after case. 13 arrests, 0 convictions. Evidence vanished. Witnesses forgot. Judges looked the other way. The streets whispered his nickname with a mixture of fear and awe. Mr. Untouchable. And Nicky? He believed it. He believed he'd built something permanent, something the system couldn't break. He believed his brothers would stay loyal, that the oath meant something, that $50 million could buy invincibility. He was wrong about all of it. June 5th, 1977, a Sunday morning. Across New York City, people opened their copies of the New York Times Magazine and saw something unprecedented. A drug lord staring back at them from the cover. Not hiding, not in shadows. Standing tall, dressed in an azure blue suit his wife Thelma had picked out, wearing a red, white, and blue tie, a deliberate symbol that crime was as American as apple pie. The headline asked a question everyone already knew the answer to. Mr. Untouchable. This is Nicky Barnes. The police say he may be Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it? The photo was Nicky's idea. The magazine wanted to use his mugshot, but Nicky Barnes hated mugshots. So he posed, smiled, made himself a celebrity. It was the ultimate flex, the final middle finger to a system that couldn't touch him. It was also the beginning of the end. Because 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., President Jimmy Carter saw that cover. And Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia who'd run on law and order, who'd promised to clean up crime, lost his mind. He called the Attorney General personally. One order: make sure Nicky Barnes doesn't beat these federal charges, whatever it takes. The full weight of the United States Department of Justice came down on Harlem like a hammer. Federal prosecutors, DEA agents, wiretaps, surveillance, informants, they threw everything at the council. And this time, they were careful. This time, they built a case so airtight even Nicky's lawyers couldn't find the cracks. In March 1977, Nicky and several council members were arrested on federal narcotics conspiracy charges. The trial was unprecedented. The first anonymous jury in American history. Their names kept secret to protect them from retaliation. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence. Wiretaps, financial records, witness testimony from people brave enough or desperate enough to talk. Nicky sat through it all with his signature confidence. He'd beaten the system before. He'd beat it again. On January 19, 1978, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hesitate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mr. Untouchable had finally been touched. The King of Harlem was going to die in a cage. But Nicky Barnes, he still had one more move to make. One final play that would destroy everything he'd built and everyone who'd called him brother. They sent him to Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, the toughest prison in America at the time. Maximum security, 23-hour lockdown, isolation from the general population. They were making sure Nicky Barnes would rot quietly, away from the streets that made him. But even in prison, Nicky tried to stay in control. He assumed his council brothers would manage the empire, keep the money flowing, pay his legal fees, take care of his family. He assumed loyalty meant something. He assumed wrong. From inside his cell, Nicky started hearing whispers, rumors, fragments of truth that cut deeper than any prison shank. His assets, the cars, the apartments, the businesses, were being liquidated. But the money wasn't going to his legal defense. The council wasn't paying his lawyers. His appeals were dying from lack of funds. Then came the betrayal that broke him. Guy Fisher. Fisher was more than a council member. He was Nicky's protege, his student, practically a son. Nicky had taught him everything: how to move product, how to count money, how to carry himself like a boss. They'd built housing projects together, invested millions side by side. Fisher called him mentor, brother, father figure. And Guy Fisher was sleeping with Nicky's mistress. Her name was Beverly Shameka Ash. Young, beautiful, vibrant. In photos, she stood with one hand on her hip, confidence radiating from her like heat. She'd been Nicky's woman, his prize, his escape from the grinding brutality of the life he'd chosen. Now she was Guy's. The council had rules. 7 men, 1 code. Treat my brother as I treat myself. That code explicitly forbade sleeping with another member's wife or mistress. It was sacred. It was the foundation of their brotherhood. Guy Fisher violated it. And when Nicky found out, sitting in that cell, powerless and forgotten, something inside him shattered. Not his pride. That had been armor for decades. Not his reputation. He'd already lost that on the front page of the Times. What shattered was the last illusion he'd been clinging to. That any of it had ever mattered. That loyalty existed. That brotherhood was real. That he'd built something more than a criminal enterprise held together by greed and fear. He called for his lawyer, and he made a decision that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. If they wanted to betray him, he'd show them what real betrayal looked like. In 1982, 4 years into his life sentence, Leroy Nicky Barnes did the unthinkable. He picked up a pen and started writing names. 109 names to be exact. Council members, lieutenants, distributors, muscle, accountants, lawyers. Everyone who'd ever worked for him, trusted him, called him boss. He didn't just give the feds names. He gave them dates, locations, transactions, murder plots, burial sites. He handed them an entire criminal empire wrapped in a bow, ready for indictment. And at the top of that list, Guy Fisher, Wallace Rice, Frank James, Ishmael Muhammad, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Joseph Jazz Hayden, his brothers, his council, the men who'd sworn to treat him as they'd treat themselves. Oh, and one more name, Thelma Grant, his wife, the mother of his children. The federal government couldn't believe their luck. This wasn't just a cooperating witness. This was the kingpin himself, offering to dismantle everything he'd spent 2 decades building. They gave him a deal: testify against the council, and we'll reduce your sentence. Nicky took it without hesitation. When the trials began, Nicky sat in the witness box and cried. Real tears streaming down his face as he detailed every crime, every murder, every betrayal. He told them how Guy Fisher had tried to bribe a cop with $100,000, how they'd ordered the murder of Mikey Puglisi, a banana soldier who'd sold them weak dope, shot 10 times in the chest, so close the muzzle flash set his shirt on fire. How the council had operated like a corporation, with boardroom meetings to vote on executions. The prosecutors loved him. The defense attorneys couldn't touch him. Everything he said was backed by evidence they'd gathered independently. The juries ate it up. One by one, the council fell. Guy Fisher, life without parole. Wallace Rice, life without parole. Frank James, life without parole. Ishmael Muhammad, life without parole. Thomas Gaps, Foreman, life without parole. Joseph Jazz, Hayden, life without parole. Thelma Grant, the woman he'd married, the mother of his daughters, got 10 years for her role in the organization. When she went to prison, their children, 2 little girls who used to swing from their father's muscular biceps, who he'd taught to swim and write their names, went into foster care. In total, Nicky's testimony led to the conviction of over 50 people. Some got life, some got decades, some cooperated themselves to avoid the needle. And Nicky? His life sentence was reduced to 35 years. Then, through good behavior and prison work programs, 2 months off for every month served, it was cut even further. In August 1998, after 20 years behind bars, Leroy Nicky Barnes walked out of federal prison a free man. Sort of. The streets wanted him dead. The council members rotting in maximum security cells had put $1 million bounty on his head. The mafia families he'd done business with considered him a rat. The worst thing you could be in their world. Even the addicts in Harlem, the ones he'd poisoned for profit, hated him for snitching. So the federal government did what they always do with rats who've outlived their usefulness but are too famous to ignore. They made him disappear. Clayton Williams. That's who he became. No special meaning to the name, he just liked how it sounded. Clean, simple, forgettable. The U.S. Marshals moved him to a quiet suburb somewhere in the Midwest. The exact location remains classified, but the details that leaked paint a picture. A small house on a normal street. Neighbors who waved hello and never asked questions. A routine built on invisibility. The man who once drove a Maserati through Harlem bought a used sedan. The man who owned hundreds of custom suits shopped at Walmart. And not just shopped there, but worked there, punching a time clock for minimum wage, stocking shelves, helping customers find dish soap and light bulbs. His daughters, now teenagers, were given new identities and brought into witness protection with him. They knew who their father had been, Mr. Untouchable, the King of Harlem, the man on the magazine cover, but that wasn't who they saw when they came home from school. They saw Clay Williams, a quiet man in his 60s, who helped with homework and grilled burgers on weekends. For 2 decades, Nicky Barnes lived this double life. By day, Mr. Respectable, the nobody from nowhere, living paycheck to paycheck like millions of other Americans. By night, the former kingpin, haunted by memories of power and betrayal, looking over his shoulder for assassins who never came. But in 2007, ego whispered again. He wrote a memoir with journalist Tom Folsom. Mr. Untouchable, My Crimes and Punishments. He appeared in a documentary of the same name, filmed in silhouette to protect his identity, flashing jewelry, and sipping champagne, trying to project the power he hadn't wielded in decades. He gave interviews, told war stories, positioned himself as a legend who'd outsmarted everyone, the Italians, the cops, even death itself. The U.S. Marshals weren't happy. The Witness Protection Program has one rule: disappear completely. Publishing a book about your crimes isn't disappearing, but they couldn't stop him. He wasn't technically in the program anymore. They'd released him from active protection years earlier when he'd served his time. They just kept tabs on him, made sure he checked in, hoped he wouldn't get himself killed. In the interviews, Nicky, still calling himself Clay but talking like Nicky, admitted he missed it. The glamour, the money, the power, the women. I didn't have financial concerns then, he told the New York Times. I do now. But he also admitted something deeper, something that cut through the bravado. There was a code. We were supposed to be brothers. That's what hurt the most. Even after everything, even after burning his empire to ash and sending 50 men to prison, the betrayal still stung. Because for all his intelligence, all his ruthlessness, all his survival instincts, Nicky Barnes had wanted one thing the streets could never give him: a real family. June 18th, 2012. Somewhere in Middle America, in a house that neighbors thought belonged to a man named Clayton Williams, Leroy "Nicky" Barnes took his last breath. Cancer, the great equalizer, had done what the streets never could. He was 78 years old. His daughters were beside him, 2 grown women with new names, new lives, new identities. They held his hands as he slipped away. This man who'd been a monster to thousands, but a father to them. His death was recorded under his assumed name. No obituary, no funeral service, no public acknowledgement that one of the most notorious drug lords in American history had died. The government kept the secret. The streets assumed he was still out there somewhere, living under their noses. For 7 years, nobody knew. Then in June 2019, when Frank Lucas, Nicky's rival, the inspiration for American Gangster, died and his obituary made headlines, a reporter started asking questions. Whatever happened to Nicky Barnes? Where was he? Was he even still alive? That's when the New York Times finally published the truth. Leroy "Nicky" Barnes had been dead for 7 years. He'd died peacefully, surrounded by family, given a quiet burial under a name nobody would ever recognize. His daughters, speaking publicly for the first time, defended him fiercely. "It's hard for us to think of Mr. Untouchable as being the same person as our dad," they said. "By the time we were old enough to understand what he had done, we had so many positive experiences with him." They remembered a loving father who taught them to swim, helped them with homework, showed up to school plays, tried desperately in his final years to be the man he'd never been allowed to become. They remembered Clay Williams, not Nicky Barnes. And maybe that was his real escape. Not from prison. He'd done that through betrayal and testimony. Not from the streets. He'd done that through witness protection and anonymity. But from himself. From the monster he'd become in Harlem. The kingpin who'd poisoned thousands. The betrayer who'd sent his brothers to die behind bars. In those final years, maybe he actually became Clay Williams. Maybe he found a kind of redemption in the suburban mundane, in minimum wage work and quiet evenings, and being present for his daughters. Or maybe he was still Nicky Barnes until the very end, playing another role, wearing another mask, surviving however he had to. Either way, he died a ghost. And in the world he came from, that might have been the greatest victory of all. But the council? It didn't die when Nicky snitched. It mutated. While Nicky was stocking shelves at Walmart, the organization he'd betrayed evolved, adapted, learned from his mistakes. The Italian families he'd partnered with absorbed what was left of the operation. New players rose in Harlem. Dealers who'd learned from watching the council's rise and fall, who understood that fame was a death sentence and invisibility was immortality. Guy Fisher, the man whose affair destroyed everything, sat in federal prison for 38 years, before being released in 2020 at 72 years old. In prison, he earned an associate's degree, a bachelor's, a master's, and eventually a PhD in sociology. All A's. He wrote books, screenplays, maintained his innocence even as the evidence buried him. In interviews, Fisher refused to blame Shemeka or the affair. "It wasn't about a woman," he said. "It was about betrayal. Nicky made the rules for the council. We all lived by them. Then he turned around and destroyed everybody who trusted him." Wallace Rice, Thomas Gapps Foreman, Frank James, Joseph Jazz Hayden, all still sitting in maximum security prisons, old men now, their youth and power wasted in concrete boxes, betrayed by the man they'd called brother, and the heroin. It never stopped flowing. The dope that Nicky cut with baby laxative and sold to Harlem's addicts kept poisoning new generations. His distribution networks were replicated by smarter, quieter criminals who learned from his mistakes. Never pose for magazine covers, never trust anyone completely, never believe you're untouchable. Because the real lesson of Nicky Barnes isn't about crime or drugs or even betrayal. It's about the American dream turned inside out. A poor black kid from Harlem who wanted a family, wanted respect, wanted to matter, and channeled all that hunger into building an empire that could only destroy him. He escaped poverty, but found prison. He escaped obscurity, but became infamous. He escaped death, but lost his identity. Every victory was also a loss, every escape just another cage. Today in Harlem, the old-timers still remember. They remember the yellow Volvo cruising down Lenox Avenue. They remember the custom suits and the diamond rings. They remember when Nicky Barnes was God in the streets, when his word meant life or death, when the council ran the city and nobody, cops, feds, politicians, could touch them. But they also remember the needles in the alleys, the bodies in the morgues, the families destroyed, the generation lost to powder and addiction. They remember that for every million Nicky made, thousands of lives were ruined, that his empire was built on the suffering of his own people. The younger generation knows him differently, as a character, a legend, a movie villain. Wesley Snipes based Nino Brown in New Jack City on him. Same initials, same betrayal by a lieutenant over a woman, same rise and fall. Cuba Gooding Jr. played him in American Gangster, though the movie focused more on Frank Lucas. The song Bad, Bad Leroy Brown, inspired by Nicky's life. He became mythology, the cautionary tale parents tell their kids. Look where that life leads. Look what happened to Mr. Untouchable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nicky Barnes was brilliant. A strategic genius who could have been a CEO, a general, a politician, if the world had given him those options. Instead, the world gave him poverty, racism, abuse, and limited choices. So he made his own choice, to become a monster who looked like a king. And for a moment, a brief, shining moment, he was untouchable, until he wasn't. Until ego put him on a magazine cover. Until betrayal put him in a witness box. Until cancer put him in a grave that nobody will ever visit because nobody knows where it is. The man who spent his life becoming visible, famous, feared, respected, died invisible. The man who built a brotherhood on loyalty destroyed it with betrayal. The man who wanted family more than anything ended up alone, except for the daughters who forgave him for everything he'd done to everyone else. And maybe, in the end, that's the most human thing about Nicky Barnes. Not his crimes, or his empire, or his downfall, but the fact that he spent his whole life running from his father, his fists, and his own insignificance, only to discover that the person he needed to escape was himself. Some men chase power and call it freedom. Some men build empires and call them family. Nicky Barnes did both, and discovered that being untouchable just means dying alone. The streets never forget a king, but they also never forgive a rat. Mr. Untouchable became Mr. Invisible, and that, more than prison or poverty or betrayal, was his real punishment. They say when you snitch, you can never go home. Nicky Barnes proved them right. He went everywhere else instead. Prison, witness protection, suburban anonymity, an unmarked grave. Everywhere except home. Because Harlem never forgets. And Harlem never forgives. The council fell. The empire crumbled. The king became a ghost. But somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a U.S. Marshal's office, there's a folder labeled Clayton Williams, deceased. Inside are the records of a man who never existed, covering the tracks of a man who once ruled New York. That's how legends die in America. Not with a bang, but with paperwork. R.I.P. Leroy, Nicky Barnes, 1933-2012. Long live Mr. Untouchable.